Let's do this. All right. So I wrote this proposal last night. So it's effectively something we talked about before, which is we have these new fancy attributes that allow us to mark APIs as being platform specific. So what I did is I used the data file that we used for the platform compat analyzer that we shipped a few years ago as a starting point. And so what I did is I basically just intersected that with the assembly information from .NET Core, and I basically just first started with a bunch of assemblies that I think should be just marked wholesale as being Windows specific, as opposed to putting attributes on specific types. I would put them on just the entire assembly, which makes it a bit easier for us to reason about. And then the other thing I thought about was, okay, what version annotation are we actually going to use? Because fundamentally what you would normally do is you would say, okay, I call an OS-specific API, which means, my feature that uses this API is only available when the underlying API is available. And, for Windows, that would mean we would hunt down the p-invokes, we would find the Windows version that introduced that p-invoke, and I would just basically forward that information inside the attribute. Since .NET Core doesn't support anything lower than Windows 7, and pretty much everything that we use was introduced before Windows 7 or in Windows 7. In other words, we don't have any usage really of APIs that are newer than that. I would just suggest we just use Windows 7 instead of hunting down the version number, because it basically does the same thing for us. And so basically what I want to do in this meeting is I want to review effectively the assemblies that I propose we are marking, and also some of the types and methods that I'm proposing marking. Are there any questions so far?
I just have a general comment on the Windows 7 thing. I realize that Windows 7 is the only thing still in support, and I realize that .NET Core in particular doesn't support, but if we're defining the API surface and the attribute is part of that, then I think it would be better to formally define that as the correct thing.
So when
just
you say
because someone else could implement, for example, Win32 registry and have it support and actually run on Windows XP.
Sure, but like how would that work when we don't support the runtime of Windows XP?
People do all kinds of crazy things, including compiling Core RT to run on UEFI, so you can run bare metal .NET without an operating system even. So
I think my stance would be, if somebody is willing to backport our runtime to Windows XP, then they're more than welcome to backport the attributes as well. I would not optimize for that.
Okay.
I mean, if somebody wants to change the version numbers, I'm not going to block that. Like if somebody says, oh, actually this was introduced in, I don't know, 3.5, then sure. Like I don't think I see much value in this, because most of these APIs are basically, as far as we are concerned, available forever, right? It's really more for things where the mainstream user will see different versions in practice, right? Versus in our case, we can pretty much assert that 99.9999999% of our customers will only ever see Win 7 or up, because we don't support anything lower than that. I think what's more interesting is WinRT, because there's some things here
able to go because we don't have a moniker to acknowledge the split between NT and whatever the other mode was.
9x
is 5, because that's when the old line had died.
Yeah, and I guess most of the stuff is probably from that era.
Yeah, I fully agree with Emo. There's not a lot of value or in spending any more time on anything less than 7.
Yeah, it's just not worth hunting down. If somebody else wants to do it for correctness later, I'm sure we would look at the PR.
Yeah, the problem in practice is why it's hard is basically you have to hunt down the actual p-invoke and then intersect that with the Windows version information, and that's maybe not.
It's actually automatically greppable from the Windows API docs. I'm using it for p-invoke generation that I do, for example.
Yeah, the problem is in my case, like, so just to give some insight into how this worked. So when I wrote platform compat, what I did is I basically wrote a tool that looks for a platform not supported exception in the code base, and then effectively bubbles that up to the public entry points. So I'm not actually looking at p-invokes at all. So like the database doesn't know which p-invokes this thing called. which if you wouldn't, so basically if you want to do that, then you would have to effectively redo the analysis to a certain extent. And that's not trivial because the analysis was also, hand authored and hand cherry picked, because the tool would over report or under report, and then we just manually added or removed things from that set. So like, I think right now it would be very manually. Somebody would actually have to go through, let's say, registry and say, are we calling any registry APIs that were, in version X or version X+1, right? And like, I mean, we can probably do this if we really cared, but like, as I said, it seems fringe.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a must-have. I was just saying, given we're the base framework, it would generally be good to be more correct when possible.
Right.
Or have that, or at least allow people to go and fix it if they felt they wanted to spend the time themselves.
I mean, I view this really as we support this on this OS version, this or greater, and that's exactly what we're saying when we put Win 7 on it.
Actually, that's a good point, yeah.
Where does this work? It's saying we support it here and up, and that's what we do. We don't support this on XP.
Right, but that brings in the question of when Windows 7 goes out of life in 2 years and we no longer ship a runtime for it, are we going to go and update all these to be whatever the latest is?
We could. It wouldn't break anyone to do it.
Yeah, we could. I mean, on the other hand, the same argument applies, right? That seems like a lot of work for very little gain, right?
It's busy work for no gain, but there would be nothing wrong with us doing so, is my point.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Yeah, if I were writing an application targeting a runtime that runs on an unsanctioned platform, I would just disable the analyzers which are performing these checks.
Yeah, although that argument is suspect in general, right? Like, if you say like, oh, I use this feature and then my fix is that turn off the feature, then that's not necessarily the right thing to do, but yeah.
No, it means I wouldn't guard my own checks. I would just call the APIs because I happen to know that the environment the app's running in would work. And if there's an analyzer saying, hey, you didn't guard this, I would suppress the analyzer.
Right.
Or not enable it or whatever, yeah.
All right, so let's just go over the list, because there's lots of stuff here. So for the assembly, so basically what I did is I took the obvious ones that I knew about. So basically registry access control, system events should be pretty much uncontroversial. I think event log is also Windows only because it's tied to the Windows event log mechanism, so are perf counters.
Sorry, I just pause. Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
There have been a bunch of comments on the issue itself, which aren't showing up in your view here.
Yeah, because that's GitHub for you. So I can open another tab for this. Let me actually find the PR for this.
Just because I went through it and commented on the ones that I knew were valid, so it feels duplicative.
Actually, I can probably do this, right? I can probably go here, right click, and then control click on that guy, right? Yeah. Look, I know how to browser. All right, so directory services protocols is now supported on Linux. So I will take this out. So that means directory services and directory service account management is still not, correct?
That's my understanding.
Account management is not supported anywhere other than Windows in this release. I don't know what is in system directory services versus system directory services protocols. So we may need to just follow up on system directory services.dll. But Joe made one of them work.
Yeah, we made the one that contains LDEP, which is the System Directory Services Protocol, so we made that one work.
That makes sense to me, yeah.
To be clear, Emo, I was just suggesting, rather than looking at this view, I was suggesting looking at the changes view, and then you'll see the full list plus the comments interspersed. Just as a suggestion.
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, like, the problem is you look at Markdown, but yeah, that probably works.
Yeah, the Markdown here is simple, though.
Yeah, because I have taste. Yeah, let me wait until GitHub finally renders this thing. Okay. Yeah, somebody was asking, why did I check in the Excel file? Funny you ask, because I just had the same problem for my .NET Standard blog post where I did not check in my previous Excel file, and when I come back 6 months later, it's nice if I have the analysis still for this. And this is a designs repo, so I personally don't care. But if somebody feels strongly about it, I don't have to check it in there. So let's just, so directory service we just handled. Yep, that's the same here. So I don't know what drive info showed up, but like a drive info apparently had at least significant APIs that didn't work.
Then those should be broken out because in general it's
Yeah.
usable.
All right. Then that's easy. Yeah, so in your GP handler, we don't ship a net5 version. That will probably prevent us from annotating it because the attribute only exists in net5.
I mean, if we think it's enough value, then we can publish a new version of, or we can rev the package.
Do the attributes need to be public? Can they just be added to the assembly as internal like we do with nullable?
In principle, yes, because we own the analyzer, right? So we don't have to look at the visibility of the attribute. I mean, in general, like you have to go out of your way to not make it work anyway. Because, I mean, unless you resolve symbols or something like that. So it might already work.
I would say we should be on the same plan as we are with nullable, as we are with the linker attributes, which is it doesn't care what assembly they come from. It just cares about namespace and name.
Yeah, that's fair too.
And then we can just compile them into the assembly.
I mean, is there any reason we don't ship a net5 version? Like, why are we backporting this guy?
We just target net standard 2.0.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, at this point, it's possibly just harvested.
Yeah, that's probably
No,
true.
we still make changes to it. We still build it, but it builds against the net standard 2.0 surface area.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we should have net standard compliant attributes for this. I guess that's the bottom line here. So,
Yeah, I mean, it may actually take some work in the analyzer to support locally defined attributes, because if it starts off with get type by name, then like it needs to accept that there will be multiple types with that name.
well, the way we would do it is similar to nullable, right? But see, what we would do is we would basically define the attributes as internal, and then basically just have them in the library defined by itself, right? And so they don't pollute the namespace for consumers, but when the analyzer looks at the methods, it will still find them.
Just saying the code in the analyzer itself that Booyah's been working on, if it starts off with the grab the type symbol and then compare attribute declarations against that type symbol, that'll need to be rewritten to ask each attribute what its name is.
Yes.
So it has to do the slow check instead of the fast check. So it's a good thing we talked about that because it changes your spec.
So system runtime interrupt service Windows runtime, we no longer ship this guy. Interesting.
That's a change for 5. We just stopped doing that.
So I guess then we don't need it anymore. Is that fair? Is it just because we don't support what is it called now, WinUI yet, or is it? So are we going to do it later, or
No,
is
we
it?
have there's a whole new infrastructure, and it all moved to a separate repo.
Gotcha. So basically, we should look into this, and then decide whether we do it over there or we don't do it at all.
So the concept still exists, but ownership and code base moved?
Well, code base is entirely different. Concept moved.
Fair enough.
So Emma, that would make this one out of scope for this particular PR then, and we'd fork another or create another issue over there, right?
Which particular thing? The Windows runtime one?
For the
Or?
Windows runtime, just make that out of scope for.
I basically just deleted it or marked it as deleted and say, looks like we don't ship it anymore.
Cool, thanks.
I think honestly everything that requires, well, that is tied to Windows runtime would probably need different attributes anyway, because Win7 wouldn't be super useful there. So that sounds. Yeah, this one didn't show up because this one was probably added after we did. Sorry, I'm looking at the cryptography one, OpenSSL. I think this one was probably done after Platform Compat did this spin, so I only know the ones that were part
it's
of
also, I mean, what would we call it for Linux, right? There is no Linux version. It's also not Linux only. It's not Windows. It'll work on FreeBSD. Currently, it works and is supported on Mac, though. I intend to do the paperwork to make that not be the case in 6.
Yeah, so that's
Don't we have this doesn't work on this OS, but it works on all others attribute?
Yeah, so well, let me quickly talk about this, because that's the other thing we just brought up with Blazor the other day. So in principle, the way the attributes work right now is they assume that if something isn't marked, it's cross-platform. And if something is marked, then it's only supported on the ones that are being marked, right? So because that's why I said earlier, this is only really meant for things that are clearly platform specific. Things that are partially portable, like reflection emit or something else that is portable to many operating systems, that doesn't really work super nicely with these attributes, because then the set of attributes or the set of checks that we expect the caller to do would vary over time, right? Versus registry will always have the same check. So the check itself is stable, right? As soon as you promote fragile checks where you have to compare for this operating system or that operating system or that operating system, you're basically back to where the problems were with browser checks in JavaScript, right? Because it's a moving base, basically.
But isn't this one just everything other than Windows?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So we don't have that capability today. So for Blazor, the same thing came up because Blazor has a similar problem where you don't really want to mark everything as supported on Windows, Mac, and basically everything but Blazor.
I'm not saying we should have an attribute for each OS. I'm saying we should have one attribute that says not Windows.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So like basically for Blazor, we are talking about doing that because you really want to exclude, not include. The challenge with that is though that it's still somewhat unclear what the check would be. We would basically just have a, if not this operating system check, which would probably work reasonably well. We don't have that yet. So like that's why and also the nice thing is this is really an analyzer realistically. So it would be something that we can do effectively every time the SDK ships, we can update that analyzer. So that's something that we can do. If we don't fit it into 5.0, we can do it post 5.0. That's why I'm focusing here on the Windows only ones because, they're easier and they're kind of stable as well.
I guess I'm not understanding. We can update the SDK anytime the SDK ships, but
right.
If it requires attributes in the libraries, how do we update that until a year from now?
Oh yeah, so that's the thing we talked with the Blazor guys. So the way that this would work is we would say between 5 and 6. So or let me say it differently. So today the problem is we can update the SDK as often as we want. We can't update the reference assemblies every time we want because we don't have a servicing story for those, right? The only way we can update them is when we ship a new version of .NET, which basically means .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7. So the way we would do it is you would say, similar to how platform compat worked, it would just say, until we can actually physically put an attribute in the reference assembly set, we would ship a sidecar file for the analyzer that just is a list of APIs that it knows about. And then we would churn that one. And then, next time we can actually have the reference assemblies, you would convert them into actual attribution into the reference assembly set. That's how that would work.
And you'd ship the sidecar file as part of the SDK?
Yeah, you would ship it literally with the analyzer. So you would still not ship out of band like a NuGet package, but you would ship effectively as part of the SDK. And so we can touch it as often as we can touch the SDK.
And presumably the design would be that sidecar file always wins. It overrides anything that's in the libraries?
Yes, because it would basically be the thing that versions more frequently, so it's assumed to be later.
So I just ask that we have that design like fully buttoned down before we ship .NET 5.
In what way? So basically your concern is that because the design is not locked down, we may not be able to do
Screw
that.
It up.
Yeah, so like that's what I'm saying. But yeah, I mean we can talk offline, but like my understanding is that like it wouldn't change anything we would do in 5.0, right? It would just change the way the analyzer or the sidecar file would work, which none of them would ship with 5.0, right?
my point is we're saying we're going to punt on some things right now for .NET 5 because we don't have a way of doing it. And the way we'll address that until .NET 6 is via this yet to be designed mechanism that we have a hand wavy plan for. And I'm saying it'd be great to have it more than hand wavy because we're basing not doing stuff in .NET 5 on that thing existing.
Fair. Like, I just want to avoid the fire rule, right? Because so the thing is, for things like this one here, where we know effectively this only works on, sorry, this doesn't work on Windows. Those things are easier. Like for Blazor in particular, the problem is that the set of APIs they know about is still churning, right? So like, my confidence that we can just annotate them in 5, or even if we said let's spend resources on this, is not very high that we get them right anyways. So that's why I'm saying, to me, the getting it done by 5, I kind of assume that we don't have the time to do that. So no matter what we do, and that's why I don't think there's a fire rule that's necessary, because we can do it later. I agree with you that the design should probably be more baked than hand wavy, but given the experience of platform compat, I think I have a pretty good design in head that will work for that. So I'm not very concerned about that. But yeah, I can totally write it up. Oh, this was my goal for next week anyway. All right, so then for the OpenSSL one, let me just record the fact that it would be nice to have a negative marker in there somewhere.
Thanks.
Where is that? That was under... Oh boy.
And yeah, I mean, it does also raise the potential problem of anything that has version, or needs this kind of version attribute on a Linux, because what does Linux mean in that case? We certainly, or I assume we don't want to paint versions of every distro ever. Then maybe the answer is we just hope we don't run into it.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you see this, right? The way I would do it is I would basically say what we would annotate is things we know that are black and white, right? So we know for a fact this thing doesn't work on Windows, right? We don't know the actual Linux distros where it all works on, so we would basically not flag it, and then just, potentially get a runtime error for those, right?
Right.
And then basically we would just, same with Blazor, right? We would just mark this thing doesn't work in Blazor. And if something else ships like Watch that doesn't support them either, then the similar thing would apply.
Yeah, just to promote something that was mentioned earlier, like the fact that it doesn't work on Windows now doesn't mean that it won't work on Windows next release, for instance. Like, things can always get added in.
Right, and that's kind of the thing with the negative attribute, is that the negative attribution would probably be versionless, because it would be somewhat, maybe it would be, maybe it would have a version, right? You would say, I know for a fact it doesn't work in this version of Windows. The question is then how we would remove that.
It would just be the opposite. It would probably be this version or earlier rather than this version or later.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm really getting at is if Windows has been moving to a model where functionality is acquired via the store rather than via some particular operating system version, we don't want to box ourselves into a corner where I can go acquire something like this from the store on an existing Windows version that's already in market.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right. All right, so let me scroll down further. So why did we stop shipping protected data?
The API surface isn't changing, and it's an OOB package, so we version locked it so the package doesn't grow.
I see, so it's also net standard 2.0?
Yeah.
I got it.
Unless it's Net Core App 3, but yeah, it's locked to a TFM that's older than 5.
Cool. So that means you just have to be more formal about our down level attribution.
Yeah, I assume that I think that's probably the same thing that's true on all the ones that Adam's pointing out. We don't ship a 5.0 package of that. We don't have a Net 5 asset in the package because we've locked to a lower TFM.
Yeah, there's probably a decent amount of them that are like this. I'm pretty sure that, a good chunk of these things here are from the compat pack, so I wouldn't be shocked that they're all net standard actually, or a good chunk of them are net standard.
Yeah, it's all going to be all of our OOBs and semi-OOBs.
Yeah, I think once we have this locked down, it just rinse and repeat for the other ones, so that's fine then. All right, specific APIs. This is where it gets more controversial. As I said earlier, one of the concerns I have is I don't want to be like I don't want to have a world where we have like a lot of platform-specific attribution all over the place. So I still want to have a kind of like a model where it's like this obviously never works on Windows, or this obviously only works on Windows, because that's much easier to reason about than these moving targets. But it seems the console APIs in particular are basically never going to work on anything but Windows because of the way the Windows terminal works. So are there any objections with marking these?
Just to confirm, if I'm running inside of like OS 10, for instance, and I open a terminal window, these APIs will not work?
So they are marked as they will throw an exception, so I assume that's true.
Yeah, if you mean like if you're using WSL2 and you try and use these, they'll throw platform not supported.
I think the question was with the new Windows terminal, which is completely different. So it's not necessarily they won't work on other platforms. It's we've not made them work on other platforms yet.
They explicitly throw platform not supported exception in our Unix implementation, and console was split into
Right. But it's not we couldn't ever support them. It's we may we don't today.
We don't today, and for almost all of these, we don't know how to support them on Unix.
And if we did add support for them in 6, we would just remove the attribute.
Yeah, like to be clear, like I think what Tanner is asking is these attributes, these APIs, like in the new terminal window, I think there's an assumption that they are more Unix-like because they support the ANSI escapes, but I still think there's a bunch of APIs, like for example, buffer manipulation and window manipulation that doesn't have an ANSI escape sequence equivalent, so there's no way to make them work on pure Unix. So in that sense, yeah, I think they will probably never work anywhere else. And even if, I mean, basically the model with that would be we just remove the attribute, or we basically, I would probably just remove the attribute at that point.
Yeah. Because we'd be back to, we don't know how to describe that it works on any Unix distro that contains lib whatever, which is mostly the things from 2022. And yeah, and we'd be like, yeah, it works everywhere. Asterisk.
Yeah. All right, so I guess then console 1 people are fine with that. For this type here, both methods are marked. The type doesn't do much else, so I'm almost inclined to just mark the entire type, which is kind of the way I would think about that. Like if basically the workhorse methods of a type don't work, I would mark the type.
Seems fine.
Like there's little value in being able to instantiate a type, then it can't actually do any useful work.
Right. I mean, we'd have the same problem if in fact, I think it is polymorphic, and if the encrypt and decrypt are overrides, then really the thing that you want to flag is the person who said new. Of you're building a thing that's going to blow up somewhere else. Granted, the fact if you return one, you have no idea if the caller is going to be expecting it or not, but it gives you the warning of like, you thought you were doing something with platforms and this isn't going to do what you want.
That's a good point. Polymorphic things might actually not work today for that reason, right? Because I think the call side is through the base type usually. And
yeah,
Rosin probably doesn't help with that. I mean, with data flow, you should be able to tell that it's the other instance, but there would be extra work.
Maybe. I mean, like if you call a method that returns a protected configuration provider and then you call provider.decrypt, it has no idea whose decrypt you're going to end up at.
Sure. Like I was just thinking, even the naive code where you say var x equals new DP API protected configuration provider, and then you say x.decrypt. I think when you look at the call set of x.decrypt, I think because the way C# works, I think it would see it through if it's a polymorphic function, through the base type normally. I don't think it will tell you that this is from the DP API protected configuration provider.
Fair enough.
And then
so
we
get the wrong attribute set.
Yeah, so like within the method you would be able to use data flow for this, but yeah, across method boundaries you're kind of out of luck. I mean, they have this, but like I would not use it because it's extremely expensive to run. And as you said, I think in those cases, we're just better off just saying, sorry, the constructor itself is platform specific, so you don't get to new it up, which seems reasonable.
So yeah, I'd move it to the type instead of the methods.
All right, so yeah, so this is getting into this territory where we don't have a good way to describe this with an attribution when certain combinations of parameters will throw. So my personal opinion is, if that's the case, we should not put an attribute, and we can then decide whether we have a dedicated analyzer that detects these particular combinations of parameters or whether we don't. And I would drive that basically by on how popular is the API. Is it actually worth it?
But I mean, these, if you're passing in like a literal period or something to refer to the local machine, why not just call the overload that doesn't take it?
Because sometimes you're not passing in a literal, it's passed in as a variable from somewhere up higher, and you set it, earlier in your program.
Sure, but at that point, now you actually want to be aware of the fact that this API might not work.
Yeah, but there's no way for there's no way with the
suppress
attributes to distinguish.
Yeah.
No, but if it's not, the thing is, if it's not a constant value, then it could fail, right? And that's the purpose of the analyzer, or that's the purpose of this attribute, to tell you like, hey, this method is not really supported. Like, I guess I don't see what the problem is.
Let's take a better example. Scroll down to the memory map files. There's literally no way to use memory map file without passing in a string. And if you pass in a non-null string, if you pass in a null string, it works. If you pass in a non-null string, it doesn't. So we're not going to say memory map files isn't supported.
Yeah, so I think to Levi's point, right, you could imagine a world where we have basically dedicated APIs for that. But my concern with that is that it's very noisy, right? Because if these APIs exist, which is, I guess, the case memory map file that exists since Whitby, I believe, like these things are super widely used, right? And then you basically have a fuck ton of false positives. You ask everybody to change their code, at which point the analyzer also loses its value when it just flags too much aggressively, right? So I think in those cases, we're better off just saying, well, let's just not have the attribute. Instead of a dedicated analyzer that can basically say, sorry, I think you're passing a non-null string here. That won't work, right? But the problem with that is these are kind of handwritten analyzers for every single case, right? Unless we find a way to formalize it, which might be very hard.
Because the only thing you would do if you accepted it as a parameter and you were the one calling it is suppress it, because you probably don't want to mark your method as, oh, I might only work on Windows.
Right.
It's like, well.
Yeah, I mean, I would opt for being conservative here. Like, I mean, that's the general stance we take on analyzers, is just reducing numbers of false positives, even if that means you're risking false negatives. Because, I mean, we live in a world right now where basically we only have false negatives. So if we can reduce the number of false negatives, that's still a huge win. But if we drown everybody in warnings, then we're not helping anybody. So then if we scroll up here, like I would just say everything that is not always failing, we should not mark. That would be my stance. Has anybody a problem with that?
So if there's any combination of parameters where it can work cross-platform, do not attribute the API.
Well, I guess maybe if I phrase it like this, it's a bit harsh. I would say if I mean, unless it's a super remote case, right, then maybe not. But like if there's very common cases of the API that will work cross-platform that enough people use, then I wouldn't mark it.
And interestingly, until I read Emo's doc, I hadn't considered a particular case, but his doc made me realize it was possible. He had annotated some enum values rather than, a whole type or the method that take those enum values. And that actually works well for us in a variety of situations. Like I talk about this later in the doc, but on Socket, there are several APIs that, only work on Linux if a specific value is passed in. But as long as, if we annotate the enum values that don't work instead of the method, then we can probably still catch 99% of the misuse.
Right.
but where it's string, that's harder.
Yeah, with string, I don't have a good option other than I mean, I've seen a bunch of call sites that, as Levi was saying, just do, open quote, period, close quote. And I feel like the noise for that would just be annoying.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that if the method body is anything other than just throw PNSE or maybe has some compat of argument validation followed by an unconditional PNSE, that we should not annotate it at this point.
Yeah, I agree.
So that means basically for these ones here, get process by ID works if the second argument is a period.
Or the local machine.
Yeah,
basically it works if it's either a period or, get hostname.
Yeah, so that's a good example, right? Like, I mean, I could imagine some attribute we put on the parameter and say this must be X to be supported, but like if it's not even a literal, then we're screwed, right?
Yep.
So get processes string, same thing. It will work when you pass in bot or the current machine name.
Yeah, these are all the
pretty much, I guess the second parameter is always the, yeah. All right, so then we have this one. Nobody has any objections to the other ones. Yeah, so graphics, I was not sure, but isn't graphics basically the DC, the what is it called, the device context thing in Win32? Like, why would that work anywhere else?
Well, there's the libgdi plus lib that we use for compatibility, on Linux, and I feel when I look at the code for this, there's an explicit comment that basically says this works on Linux.
Huh.
Yeah, we explicitly support system drawing on Unix-based operating systems. Not all operations necessarily work the same or work, but they are implemented as people request them or fixed where possible.
Gotcha. Well, in that case, okay, if the type is generally supported, then the type is supported, but not all methods, in which case we should just mark these methods. I mean, again, these are the ones we know of.
Well, but
yeah.
Like Steve's comment here, the copy from screens only fail on Mac. They work on Linux, according to the Unix implementation here. And then they will work on Mac if you set an environment variable. So it's back to the method body has logic that only has an else PNSE. Yeah. So we should not attribute these. It sometimes works on every OS.
I mean, no, maybe the analyzer, and this gets beyond the current design, but we've talked about competence levels for analyzers in the past. Like being able to have some things be a warning and some things be an IDE suggestion, or some things be a warning, but like I'm only 25% sure of this. Don't trust me on it. Maybe we need something like that in some of these cases.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's something that we should probably play with, but like I'm
not saying for .NET 5. I'm just saying we're taking baby steps here.
Yeah.
For a baby step, could we start with just some pretty extensive remarks in the API docs?
I mean, we already have that today in many cases, but the problem is that the docs are also not actually always up to date and not always read. And it's actually kind of hard to do that. What I was playing with in the past was saying, instead of generating a warning, we basically just change the colorization of the identifier that the IDE displays, which kind of maybe make it orange or something to indicate that there might be an issue here, but we're not causing a lot of noise. That one we haven't really explored any further, but like the problem with any sort of like warning or suggestion is that I'm really concerned you just ground the people, when in actuality what you really want is when somebody writes code, you want them to consider the impact that they have on their cross-platform thing, right, as they're writing it. Once they've written it, once it's tested, the value also goes down. Because then you just back to square one, where it's like, well, what does it mean if you're 25% sure, right, or 31% sure? Like, where do you draw the cutoff line?
at 27.2.
I mean, what might be useful is basically providing this information on demand, right? If somebody right-clicks their library and says, "Tell me everything where I might have a problem beyond what you normally think," or something. But yeah. All right.
Right, but now we're back to needing some other kind of attribute of maybe sometimes fails.
Yeah, maybe platform specific. All right, memory met files. So we talked about those. We should not mark any of the create methods then.
I'm pretty certain the create or open, and I know that the open existing will just not work. Like, so the ones below my comment, I believe should all be attributed.
Creator open wouldn't work if you pass null?
It'll, well, yes and no. It'll, no, actually, I think it won't work. I'm 90% sure it won't work.
That's above
Convenient.
27.2.
Yeah, it's convenient that right now the source.net is the Unix implementation.
Aha, victory. I feel like it has an extremely convoluted, I'm not in front of my computer right now, but memory service is an extremely convoluted set of logic split across the PAL where every possible path leads to a PNSE or an argument null, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so the creator open methods prohibit the name to be null or empty. So if null is the only thing that works for create from file, then yeah, we can go ahead and mark creator open and open existing as Windows only.
Yep.
Yeah, and then open existing definitely doesn't work because you need to give it a name.
Open the null file, obviously.
Obviously.
I'm sure that's very useful. All right. Name pipes. Sorry. The regular pipes one. Run as client. Works on Unix, you're saying?
Yep.
All of them?
I don't know. I was just looking at the one that was highlighted.
Well, I mean, like, is it... Because presumably Emo got this from a tool. Maybe he ran it on, like, Netcore 2. But is this that, like, it fails on Mac but works on Linux and the other...
all of them as an all
Unix?
No, I'm pretty sure it works on all of them. I think it was probably... If memory serves, like, Emo ran the tool on, like, 1.1 and we implemented it in 2.0 or something like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think most of the heavy lifting was done in 1.1.
Okay.
Which is also why we probably have things that are changed at this point. But like,
I mean, so just if you did the analysis in 1.1, but we did the massive API bring back for 2.0, and a lot of the APIs we left out of 1.0 and 1.1 were things that were Windows specific, are we missing a lot of data here?
no, because I think no, I don't think so. Because I added, definitely when we did the .NET Standard push, I ran it again because I remember now that we added the compat pack, which was also in the 2.0 timeframe. And that's where a lot of the Windows specific things came in to begin with. So it might have been actually 2.0. It might have not been 2.0. I mean, yeah, I think it was probably 2.0, not 1.1.
Yeah, so maybe we made it work in 2.1 and you analyzed 2.0 or something.
Yeah, something like this, yeah.
Okay. As long as we have the 2.0 API bring back wave, then we're on good footing.
Well, most of these APIs didn't exist in 1.1. Yeah, that's actually now I'm thinking about it. Anyway, so right, pipe stream. Okay, so that means kind of we probably want to mark the enum then, right?
Yeah, and I hadn't noticed when I added my comments initially that 2 lines down you were suggesting marking the enum.
Okay, so basically we would not mark pipe stream set mode. We would mark just the enum member.
I think that's the right call.
Yeah.
That should catch the majority. I mean, unless someone was like casting the integer value to the enum, at which point they're asking for it.
So regarding enums, just devil's advocating here, if this means that we would give you a warning that you have platform-specific code if you wrote if pipestream.readMode = pipe transmission mode.message.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe.
I don't know if we can special case equality and switch statements, and because those are equality. But I'm just pointing out that would be the concern, is where somebody's using it as they're probing
As a guard in and of itself.
Yeah, that they're using it as a guard instead of they're using it as an input value.
That's fair.
I mean, let me think about this for a moment. I think we can probably special case that the analyzer would be my guess. Because the thing is, we know, of course, what you do with the value. So I think for an enum, probably the most useful thing to do is block assignments. And everything else is probably fine.
Right. I mean, there's going to be
assignments and arguments.
Yeah, assignments, method calls, right? Like things where you pass the value effectively to something else.
Yeah. I don't know how easy it would be for all the flow stuff, but doing like what the compiler does for stack.lx_span, essentially you would get the like, okay, you assigned this to a caution thing, but like if you only use it in a guard, I'm not going to warn you, but if you passed it as something else, now I have to warn you that like some paths may be weird. So I'm just this one I think is going to be the biggest source of us introducing noise, and it may be that we keep refining it over time, but I'm bringing it to consciousness right now.
That's good. My guess is it won't be too bad, because we, to do the guard checks for something like this, you're already going to have to walk up from the expression to see if there's, what if block you're inside of. And to do that, you're going to pass through assignments and you're going to pass through arguments and whatnot. So,
yeah, I'm just like, I can imagine code that has a local.
It's likely a bug farm, but yeah.
Yeah. But I can see you assigned a local and you're using that in an if later. You didn't pass it as an input parameter to something. And so it's it's not all assignments are bad. It's non-local assignments are bad. But then we need to paint the local as a bad value itself. So that's the complex flow things, and maybe we don't need that in wave one. But
I mean, what's also worthwhile is just actually seeing what happens when we turn it on, right? I mean, like I would not be shocked if the vast majority of usages is just enums being passed around, and then if the if check is extremely low, then also suppressing it locally is fine too, in my opinion. Like if it's very common that you use it, then maybe we should special case it in the analyzer. But
okay, yeah, I'm just making sure that we're thinking about all the potential problem spaces. And so as long as we have considered it, and especially there's the wonderful annotate these things, run the analyzer, and see how many warnings we get, and then that tells us what things we forgot to consider.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now the way the analyzer works anyway is, I'm not sure how much Manish generalized it out, but I believe last I checked they were still plumbing the flow analysis to the generic framework through anyway, which means it does flow analysis for data as well. So I think at the time we run, we can basically ask flow analysis for data as well. So it wouldn't make it more expensive, but my concern, similar to like Stevens, is like the more convoluted you make the analyzer, the more likely that you have bugs, right? And that we should avoid if we can help it.
Yeah, I'm not saying we need to fix it right now. Just that it's if we've thought about it and we think it's the right thing to do, that's great. I just don't want us to get caught by surprise on things.
Yeah. All right. So help me make sure I got the right takeaway on that. So are we going to leave the attribute on that method then?
No, we would.
No,
we would do it on the enum.
We're going to add it to the.
So I don't.
To the enum value.
Okay, but then that would mean the analyzer would need to check arguments to the method, look at the values to see if they're enums, and see if the enums see if the enum value has the attribute, right?
Yeah, I think it's a sliding scale here. We start by adding it to the enum member. We see, either by observation or by running the analyzer or whatever code bases we have available to us, how much noise there is. And we start adding special cases for we only flag if it's an assignment or an argument, and then we only flag if it's blah, blah, blah. And we add in the data flow analysis, and, we kind of go down the rabbit hole.
Right.
Okay.
Like I think right now, like Booyah shouldn't do anything. Basically, like depending on how the thing is written, I believe she already will find enum members anyway because it just appears effectively, field reads, right? Static field reads, and so they should effectively show up as anything else. So the only thing we then can do is what you said, is basically saying we only complain about the usage of an enum if it's stored or passed as a parameter rather than on every read. So to avoid effectively the case where you say x double equals some enum value. But I think that's something, as Steven said, I would honestly just wait for actually running it on the real code base to see what patterns we see. Because my gut feel is it's probably for enums that are very frequently used in configuration, probably relatively rare to read these values outside of actually creating something.
That raises a good point, though. If it's not already in our plan, like we should definitely have it in our plan to pick real applications that we have access to, compat code bases, legacy code bases, whatever, and like use those. Those are going to be much more informative than, say, .NET Runtime about the value of the analyzer and whether it's noisy.
I mean, my default assumption is we run them on Runtime and Roslyn already, right? Or that's, I think, one of the things we do usually. Mm-hmm. So I would start with that.
I just don't think. I mean, we should definitely do that. Like that's a min bar, but I feel like we need to do it on some actual applications as well.
Okay. Booyah, were you trying to say something?
Nope.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. I will check whether we can find an app suite somewhere.
Yeah. So I think, Jeff, that what we have is the iterative plan of. Step one is we don't special case anything, so it's talking about the CNUM member is a warning, and then we say, okay, we identify a class which is it's being used in a inequality or equality check. Let's ignore that one because that's a guard, and then we keep finding places of it's not inappropriate to use the CNUM member, and then we suppress the warnings in those cases, we don't raise the warnings in those cases so that people don't have to write the suppression. But we start naive and then work our way up based on data.
And then if we find that's just inefficient or insufficient, we switch to basically, any use of the enum is okay unless it's in one of these node places where it's not, like being assigned or stored into a method.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so then let's go further. So ports. So I said, should we mark this entire thing? Because the list of APIs were very high. But I also remember that we made part of it available cross-platform. Like, is the data here outdated? Or is it really so that most of the things don't work? Because, I mean, looking at this data here, it suggests the type doesn't work at all.
It was implemented about a year ago.
Okay, so probably the data is outdated here.
Yeah, because like serial error received event args dot event is just a get set or get private set. So there's no PNSE in reading that property.
Is there anything that those platforms not supported in serial port at this point, or is everything supported?
There probably is. My guess is you ran this over an auto-generated PNSE assembly.
Yeah. The fact that it's painting like everything means it was, as Eric likes to call them, a turd assembly.
Probably. So should we then just start with not marking it, or should we investigate?
We should probably investigate it, but it's going to need to be member by member rather than all up. I also don't know. I'd have to check. I don't know if the implementation of this works on Mac. I didn't check that.
Well, it probably. I don't think Macs have serial ports, right? So.
You might be able to do an RS-232 to USB. I don't know. Or USB-based RS-232 extension breakout board.
Windows machines can support RS-232 over USB. I assume Mac can as well. That
is a bold assumption, unless it's what is it,
I'm sure it can if it's Apple certified hardware with whatever the magic negotiate thing is.
All right.
So I think ports or whatever assembly this is would have to go back to owner for assessment.
Yep.
Unless you can easily just rescan assemblies and conclude the IL body is just throw PNSE.
I mean, I can, which is probably the easiest thing to do, and then just use it as a starting point. The tricky thing usually is to find the right implementation, right? So what I did for the platform, I just downloaded the runtime and then run it over the runtime, and then found public entry points in the runtime. But like for NuGet packages, it's harder because you have to basically pick the correct binary, which is
and so I guess your data may also be missing if it's the public entry point calls a helper thing, which eventually concludes, wait, we didn't write this on Mac, and gets a PNSE there. But
no, because like I'm not just naively checking the root, because that would not find almost anything in the BCL. What I did is I set up to 5 levels deep, which also is one of the reasons why I have lots of false positives, because if you do that, well, there's a lot of code now between you and the platform not supported exception, so there might be a lot of conditions under which it throws rather than it doesn't work at all, right? But like I don't think we are very likely to miss those things. We are very likely to over-index. But I think we already did an initial pass. I think Steve, like 2 years ago, did an initial pass and removed a ton of stuff from it. All right, so basically what Steven is saying, none of these things are platform specific then.
The HTTP listener timeout manager one is, but the IP endpoint and socket address ones are not.
I was about to say, I just checked the timeout manager and all those sets are throw. Okay. Assuming they work on, yes, because I'm in timeoutmanager.manage.cs, so.
Makes sense.
Possibly this means we have the Windows version and that they work there.
All right, then all the socket ones, I assume, are also not platform specific then?
Almost all of them are not. So the set IP protection level one at the bottom is Windows specific. And then the IO control ones in the middle there are this work for some input values. Based, like some of the control codes work and some of them don't.
Is that an enum as well?
There is, yeah. And if you scroll down just a tad,
I see.
All out 3, yeah. And then there's a very rare path in accept async that's not worth talking about, other than to say, if you have the socket async args configured in a very specific way, it may not work.
But using the all or nothing heuristic, that means we wouldn't paint it.
Correct. And we definitely should not paint it. The API is super widely used, either directly or usually indirectly on Unix.
You mean the IO control one, or?
No, the accept async one.
I see. So even IO control, though, we probably wouldn't mark this one, right? We just mark the enum and then
we should just mark basically all the enum members that are not the 3 that I listed.
Yeah, which means
which
as far as
34 of them.
But it means as far as methods go, the only method on socket we would mark is set IP protection level.
I believe that's the case.
Yeah. Okay. So then, let me just record these guys here.
There's also the socket information constructor, which I believe only works on Windows still.
Oh, right. Those were added after you ran your tool emo.
Sorry, which one?
We just brought those back. We just brought those back for .NET 5, right, Corey?
I think it's been there. It just it didn't work.
Oh, right. It didn't work on Windows either.
Yeah, but now it works on Windows.
Yeah. It's a constructor and a duplicate method or something like that?
Yeah, there's duplicate and close, which I did we make that one work on Unix?
I honestly don't remember.
I can't. I know Anton did something. I can follow up on that.
Are these two
But,
methods,
no, at
duplicate
least the
and
constructor
close,
doesn't.
or is there one method called duplicate and close?
There's one method called duplicate and close.
I see.
Which source.net says is PNSE on Unix.
Okay. All right, let me
I don't
add-
know if it works on Windows.
Yeah,
No,
so it's the
doesn't work.
two things. There's a constructor that takes a socket information type. That one throws PNSE, and then the duplicate and close method throws PNSE. Good memory, Corey.
All right, then socket task extensions, we leave them all as well. So unmark those. TCP listener. And the transmit file options.
So that's an enum, and the first two options do work on Unix. The rest don't.
I see. So that means we
Although
should.
I
see.
can't remember right now if we just ignore them or if they actually throw an exception. I couldn't tell you.
I see. So by these two, you meant literally just the two members. You didn't mean the two types.
Oh yeah, correct. Yeah, TCP listener.allow NAT traversal that throws.
Okay, so we should leave that in.
Transmit file options.disconnect and transmit file options.reuse socket are both respected. Sorry, I should have been more clear.
Okay, so that means we unmark disconnect and reuse socket, but we keep TCP listener, allow net traversal, we keep transit file options, use kernel APC, use system thread, and right behind.
Correct.
Cool. And then same with UDP client, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
I mean, the TCP listener allow NAT traversal looks like it would get a bubble up. It would need the attribute anyways because it calls set IP protection level.
Nice.
Yeah, I almost commented on that one to say I think this is implemented, and then I looked at set IP protection and saw nope.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like whatever makes server socket be null, it will succeed because it just sets a field, but then probably something will blow up later.
Yeah, so interop, like, I think they all look very commie to me, which, yeah, I'd be shocked if they
If
all
any of
work.
these work on Unix, it's probably an accident.
Yeah. All right. Jeremy, you know this better than anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I would just honestly, I'd mark the whole CSP key container info.
So that means we unmark all of this, mark whole type.
Yeah, so CSP key container info and CSP parameters, marking both of those will cover the one, like that'll then make the, it'll bubble up to the appropriate constructors and properties on the RSA and DSA crypto service provider types. And then cryptDerive key is correct, and the import CSP blob is correct, I think.
Okay, so sorry, you're basically saying if you mark CSP container info, we don't have to mark the property on the service provider.
Well, we will, because the analyzer would yell at you that you're a cross-platform member that calls a platform-specific API, right?
That one
so that
actually
we would-
not sure that it does that.
Well, we would get the warning in our own build that we called a platform-specific API from a non-attributed context.
Oh, yeah, that one. Yes.
So then we would add the
Yes.
add the property or add the attribute. So get CSP key container info on both RSA and DSA CSP should be Windows only. The whole return type from that should be Windows only instead of the properties individually. And then you marked on RSA crypto service provider the two constructors that take a CSP parameters. Those are both good. You, I think, probably missed an equivalent one on DSA crypto service provider, but we should just mark the whole CSP parameters type as platform specific.
technically it's just a struct, so it would work on Unix, but there's nothing you can do with it. So I would overpaint that one just because it makes life happier.
Okay, so that means we will add a new member here that is basically CSP parameters. The type should be marked.
Yeah.
And then basically whatever the fallout of that is.
Yeah.
And the other ones that just talks with byte arrays, you said they were right.
Yeah, I'll look and see if we made that one work or not. It looks like we made those work. So you can remove the import CSP blob.
Okay, import CSP blob I remove from both the DSA and the RSA. And then what about the middle one, the crypt derived key?
That one is definitely Windows only.
Okay. Obviously.
I feel like there should be a second hit of that, but maybe it's in a different assembly. It got complicatedly moved for layering for NetCore before we tried completely removing it because it was not going to work on non-Windows. So it got duplicated in the right as we were starting the project, before I joined the team.
So in other words, it's not your fault. And then the X509 chain constructor?
Correct. That only works on Windows. The one that takes inpitter only works on Windows.
Cool. Yeah, so service model, I feel like similar to Stephen, like I don't think anybody here has enough expertise to say that. So let's just scroll past all of this.
If the string comma exception constructor really throws PNSE, that's really sad.
So which one?
The first thing under WCF was an exception type, which said that its message comma inner exception was platform specific.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked, but that's possible that it's also picking up a turd assembly, but
fair enough.
All right, threading. As long as the string is null, so that means we should probably mark them as unmark them for the same argument.
That's only the constructors, right, Steve?
Yeah, the open existing and try open existing will work.
Okay.
So it will work or won't work?
Will not.
Yeah.
Just the constructors are fine, but the two following those need a string.
And then I guess semaphore, same thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so signal and wait one will also be unmarked then.
Thread.set apartment state.
Try set apartment state will work and always return false, but then set apartment state I believe will throw because it just says if try set apartment state returns false throw, I think.
Oh, yep, I got it.
Yeah. Cool, so that's actually a decent number of APIs we marked. So what's harder for us to do is checking that we didn't forget anything. But like, I mean, one thing I could do is run the tool again.
I was going to say we could do one of two things. We could run the tool again, or we could just search for throw new platform not supported exception and see if, you know, eyeballing it, it seems like it'll bubble up to anything else. In most cases, I would imagine it'll be just at the top level.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some of the PNSEs will be just doesn't work in core, but like that we just never, that it's a member we brought back for net standard 2 alignment, but we didn't actually bother with an implementation. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I believe we would have some.
Yeah, like let me do this. Like, let me just go run the tool again, because I think we were good people back then. We added a manual inclusion list and a manual exclusion list. So we should not, like if I run it again, we should be able to still subtract and add the ones we did manually. And then everything that is net new, we can then review. So that should be doable.
There definitely seem to be some that are missed. Like I just did a search and one of the first things that comes up is arg iterator, which I didn't see in the list here.
Yeah, arg iterator, I think we added later, right? I think there was a lot of discussion on not adding it and then adding it eventually. I think in general, like if it's runtime throwing, I can't see that. So if it's an internal runtime call, then out of luck.
Well, but like arg iterator has public override int get hash code throw new PNSE.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right, I will just run this thing again and then see what falls out. Anything else? So the only other thing that I've heard as far as work goes here is the exclusion addition to the spec, which I will probably drive more from a Blazor standpoint, and then the other part was the analyzer on enums. Did I miss anything else? Yeah, the net standard 201. Basically,
right, let's do about attributes. Yeah.
Cool.
And then the overarching find anything we missed.
Yeah, so basically it's 3 things, right? It's like or 4 things, right? It's the spec work for NetStandard 2.0, it's the spec work for the enum analyzer, it's the removal or the exclusion attribute rather than the inclusion one, and then run the analysis again.
Yeah, and would the exclusion attribute, would we want to warn if you called that from a unattributed context?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing we need to think through.
Right.
Probably not.
It is a you are not as cross-platform as you think you are, but
yeah. So I haven't really thought about that
both
part.
Positive and negative are infectious.
Yeah. So the way we thought about this in the Blazor context is so Blazor has 2 problems. One of them is it's really cross-cutting concerns that don't work in Blazor that are like not really platform specific at all. And then there's the other problem that it's very widely used APIs, right? Like file.io, networking, threading. So I don't think it's desirable to say when you do file new class library that we suddenly warn you for everything that might not work in Blazor, because the vast majority of class libraries don't care whether they will work in Blazor, right? Because Blazor is this somewhat narrow scenario for .NET developers, right? Versus not running on Mac or not running on Linux, you can argue, well, they're kind of the same computer, so you probably should be optimizing for that. But if there's a very new environment, like an Apple Watch, for example, that is super constrained as well, it probably would be like Blazor, where it's like, okay, we have an analyzer for that, but we don't care about Blazor issues by default. You have to opt into that, because otherwise we just drown people in warnings again for platforms they may never care about. And if the scenario really is that the vast majority of new class libraries will not target this environment, then we should have a way to opt these things in manually or opt out manually, or whatever the process for that is. And they will probably also bubble to the context. Sorry.
No, I thought you were finished. Keep going.
Yeah, no, that was it.
How are we thinking about APIs that throw platform not supported exception regardless of OS?
So the ones whose documentation says platform not supported exception, .NET Core : in all cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they should.
It just throws platform not supported exception regardless of.
We should mark those as obsolete and just say you should never call these APIs.
In the Net 5 TFM, or like what I guess in wherever place they're throwing. I guess it'd be weird if it's net standard and it shims to framework, but that would probably be a
Well, so that's the problem with net standard, right? Like, so that's why originally the analyzer was very heavily designed to be out of band, because the assumption was we can never annotate net standard after the fact, right? But now that we converged in the .NET 5 timeframe, I think we can just assume that we can touch the reference assemblies in general, right? But it's more like a servicing problem, right? It's like, well, we can't service the existing ones, so you only get them the next time we get to ref the assembly set, which is .NET 5, .NET 6 kind of thing, right? And so I think for the Blazor scenario, like I will formalize the, sidecar information somehow in the SDK, and I think we can decide that we generalize this for obsolescence as well if we really cared enough. But I think it's totally fine to say, yeah, sorry, like, we will do it in .NET 6 if we forget something in .NET 5. Like, it's not terrible. It's terrible for Blazor because there's lots of stuff that doesn't work in Blazor, and people who want to build Blazor apps don't want to have landmines everywhere. But I think for esoteric APIs that we decided to make throw everywhere, that we will not have that many of them, right? And so I think we can probably scan for them relatively straightforwardly. And I guess in my case, that would just be it throws an exception on all three platforms, right? That's kind of how you would find them today. And then we would just mark them as obsolete. Besides thread.abort, is there anything else that we have in that category that we know
of? Every get object data method.
Sorry, which one?
All of the get object data is related to runtime serialization.
90% of app domain. So, I mean, those are things that like the runtime dropped. And then I feel that there are things that we brought signatures back for net standard 2.0 that there are things that we didn't make work, but I can't think of any of those off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think I mean, the reason I'm asking is because then I can actually, check that my tool finds them. I guess if they literally throw PNSE, it's easy. If they literally if it's an internal runtime call and that throws somehow, then we're out of luck. But like app domains probably throws in managed code would be my guess.
Probably.
Some of the remoting stuff probably also throws.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me search for those and then make sure we get those covered.
Tanner, since you would be the most likely to know, is there anything other than intrinsics that we have architecture-based limitations on? And do we need to be concerned about those? Like only works on x86 64.
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head. There might exist some though. I think for the most part we try and limit that type of stuff to just to the intrinsics though, and everything else we try and make sure has some kind of software fallback.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking about, there's another spec I wrote, which is in the design sweep when anybody cares, which is capability API checks, where the assumption, so a good example here would be reflection emit and also the intrinsics, where you're expected to check, a dot is supported property somewhere, and having an analyzer that will able to do that. The challenge with these analyzers is that because the APIs are an open-ended set, it's a bit hard to formalize this, but I think I have a mechanism that could work in those cases. And so we could imagine a case where we would basically have an attribute that you apply on on something that says, well, this is basically guarded by capability check. So the call side should be under a capability check, or it should forward its requirement to its callers with a capability check. And so it would work similar to the BinOS platform attribution, but instead of requiring effectively an if check against is OS platform or earlier, or later, you would basically say for the capability API that this thing marks. And that works reasonably well for those kind of cases. It might be tricky for things like hardware intrinsics because we got fancy with inheritance, where it might not be able to tell that it's okay to check against the derived one and then cover the base one, but we may be able to formalize this.
Okay, I'm just like, we have, OS, and then architecture is the only other thing that I can think of this ran on my box but doesn't run over here.
Yeah, I would not like, so to be clear, like I don't think what we should do is we should not formalize RIDs or architecture similar to OS platforms. I would just say we have OSs because they're super common, and then we have effectively capability checks. And that's for everything else. Because I mean, for example, ref emit, you don't want to really have people saying for like, oh, there's like 3 different things you can check for, right? And it doesn't seem worth it. We should just say there's capability APIs for these things, and you check those.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm making sure that while we're talking about the notion of OS specific, that there's not another big sweeping category that would cover things. And architecture is the only thing I could think of that would do that.
Yeah, the one thing I will say though is like, so native is probably, so the bigger problem is people wrapping native APIs and shipping them themselves. And that's a bigger problem. But I think you could argue that they have to do it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, for the analyzer spec, you could decide that you wanted to paint anything that used an extern, but that's probably just super noisy.
Yeah. I mean, if you call an OS platform API, we can probably check those. So I think it would not be unreasonable for us to find p invokes to Windows and then tell you that, oh, you're calling a Windows API because we know about it. And even suggest the correct attribution because we know what version they were introduced in, right? So that wouldn't be unreasonable, but like I think that would be some non-trivial amount of work for us to actually do that.
Yep.
And I think we generally don't care. I think the idea is if you write a p invoke yourself, like you're a platform extender, so like you have to do some more heavy lifting yourself.
Yep. Fails on the cost value analysis.
I think that's fair. All right, so then we have still 30 minutes left. Unless somebody has something related to this, I would just open up the backlog.
Got something tangentially related to this, and Tobe, I think you were kind of looking at the other PR for adding other platforms to the OS platform list as well. I was confused on where we were landing on the Mac OS and OS X platform comparisons. Is that appropriate to bring that up here?
Oh, totally. So, is it an issue I should look at, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to grab a link here. So on pull 39064. We had talked during the API review 39064. That was pull instead of issue.
Yeah,
it'll fix that.
Cool.
The magic of routing.
We had talked about trying, hiding OS X, making sure OS X and Mac OS are equal.
Right.
But Merrick had pointed out that is a breaking change the way we had implemented it. So trying to figure out the right way to merge those things together.
Sorry, where's the comment?
Right there.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it this way. I would do it the other way around. But yeah. I would basically just say macOS is an alias for OS X, and we just hide OS X. Because who cares what the underlying string is?
Yeah, we do explicitly in framework guidelines say never depend on the value of toString, except for the members whose whole purpose is to build a string. But toString is supposed to be for diagnostic and display purposes and not for runtime evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, we say that, but like, I mean,
but yeah,
I mean,
the safer change is probably to special case the is OS platform on Mac, since we already have a split build there.
So yeah, as supposed to, then the underlying string is forever OS X.
Yeah, I mean, like that seems fine. I don't think. I mean, if somebody has an aesthetic issue with that, then that's unfortunate. But I think that's I mean, if we really cared what people see in the debugger, right? We can easily have a debugger display attribute where you say you have a toDebugger display method, and that one basically doesn't render OS X, it renders macOS, right? Like if we really cared enough, but like. I agree with Merrick. The problem is OS X is around for so long that people very likely have written code against it. And I don't dare to reason about what code they have written.
Okay. So then just having macOS return the value of OSX, and then the way we were trying to do that is whenever you're calling constructor, passing in the string, we would just coerce the string. So if you passed in the string macOS, we would coerce the string to OSX and let everything else flow through thereafter. I think that works well in that approach.
Sorry, I didn't get the coercion part. You're basically saying you would change the constructor of OS platform to say if you passed in OSX, sorry, if you passed in macOS.
If you pass in the string macOS, we would set the value of the platform name to be OSX. So then the rest of the logic for equality and everything lines up against OSX there too.
I mean, yeah, I don't know that. I guess I think that just on the Mac OS build, we would make the equals method have a variant build that accepts either of the two names, and we would make the isOS platform use that method.
I mean, another option is we just don't do that at all. We just
consider it a culture or a context-specific comparison. The two strings are the same if and only if you're running on a Mac.
I mean, you could do that, or you could literally just say we don't care, right? You could just say you literally have two strings. You have macOS and OS X. They're both valid strings. And then the only party that has to handle that they are equivalent is the implementation of isOS platform. And of course the analyzer, right? Because our analyzer doesn't see but our analyzer has to do that anyways, because the analyzer never sees the literal string no matter what, right? Our analyzer has to know that OS X and macOS are equivalent.
Yeah, because I believe we explicitly didn't make an API that tells you what your current platform is, so you couldn't have written it as a equal sensibly yourself,
right?
Unless you're comparing a variable to some other variable.
Exactly.
You can do OS platform dot equals OS platform though.
Right, but where did you get one of them? That would be you're comparing a literal against. So we can make the equals work, but I don't think that we need to care about the two strings, and because while you can have written Merrick's example here, someone somewhere gave you the OS platform. The system did not give it out to you.
Yeah, that's the thing. The original design was always that like we can have kind of families of OSs and specific OSs, both identified by OS platform, which means the idea was always that isOS platform can return true for multiple distinct values, right? So for example, you could imagine that we have an Ubuntu entry there, and if you ask Ubuntu, are you Linux, it says yes, and if you ask, are you Ubuntu, it also says yes, right? And I think that's kind of why we never exposed an API that told you what OS it is. So you never have to compare them yourself. You just literally take the thing and pass it on to isOS platform, and that's the only thing you get to do. So you can only basically ask the currently running OS. You cannot compare random OSs. So in that sense, I don't think we have to line the strings.
So as far as this type goes, OS X and macOS are different. And then in the implementation, or in the isOS platform, and isOS platform, whatever the minimum and earlier, I can never remember those names.
Yeah.
Those checks would have to handle that they're equivalent platforms.
Which I don't think is terrible, right? Because it's kind of the Ubuntu model, right? Where you say like, well, the party that is running knows which, that's the party that can actually tell you which names are equivalent and which ones aren't. The only downside to this model is that basically the analyzer has to replicate that. But that's always the case because we don't have literal strings, right? We only have enums here. So as soon as you have different identifiers, the thing has to know what it is.
Yeah, I don't like having to dual maintain the equivalence check in the analyzer and in the guard method.
I mean, if that becomes a concern, one thing I thought about is an attribute that we can put on OS X that basically says alias 4 or something like that. In which case, the analyzer can just read that metadata to actually know that. But right now, we only have the case for macOS, so an if check seems more appropriate, I guess.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, I think that's going to be a problem no matter what we do because of the way OS's version and work, right? So another instance where it was brought up was, imagine we want to specificate different browsers in WASM. So you have now Chrome, and then you have Edgium or whatever we will call it, right? And then you have, so does Edgium not say it's Chrome? Probably not, right? So like no matter what we do, like there will always be these cases where one thing is multiple things depending on how you ask. So I really don't see there's a way around that problem.
Should there be another method on runtime info to do the equivalence check in one spot?
But what? So, but
we
what
have
would
that. It is platform.
Yeah.
Yeah, but his platform checks what your current platform is, not checking to see if two things are equivalent.
But why would you want to know that Chrome and Edgium are sometimes isomorphic? Like the whole purpose of this type was you never get to ask anything about anything other than am I this?
I see.
No, there's no comparison. There's no, you get to ask what am I, and you write your own switchafall that has a bad else because we've added new platforms. It's you ask am I this, and you react to that yes no question. It's the 20 questions version of what am I.
A reason why you might want to know is because even though both are Chrome and they both have a shared baseline, there is difference in what extensions are exposed in some extension specific APIs that may be available. It's just like if you're writing a graphics engine, you're going to write against Vulkan or DirectX. But you might also want to expose specific functionality if you know you're running on an AMD card or an NVIDIA card or an Intel card. And so you may want to query for specific extensions beyond that base level.
And that's fine. I mean, we can imagine doing this in various ways. One of them is we literally have, I mean, it may be a bad example here that we have OS platform entries for extensions, and then you can ask for those. Or we literally just have a different way of doing this. But I think the idea would be, the problem that we basically have is that OSs get forked and versioned over time. So at a given point in time, 5 years ago, for example, there was only Chromium. There was nothing else. And then, Microsoft built their own browser based off of Chromium. And now we basically have Chrome and Edge, both based off of Chromium. But there probably are Chrome-specific things in over Chromium, and there's probably Microsoft-specific things over Chromium as well. And so the way this would work is you would say we would have just started with Chromium, and then we would have added Chrome and Edge later. And then the person who writes the check knows that Edge is a superset of Chromium. But that's kind of like domain knowledge at the point you write the code, right? But the person who wrote the code a few years earlier only knew about Chromium, so that's the only check they have. And that's why it's bad if you expose an enumeration, because then the problem is when we add new things to it, now you have bad else code in your code. But that person from 2 years ago also would not have had the need to ask for an Edge specific extension because it didn't exist at the time he wrote the code. All he cared about was something that was in Chrome, right? And I think that's kind of the model why we want to have this a bit more open-ended and a bit more flexible, so that the implementation can be a bit more forgiving. But that doesn't mean that you can't specifically ask for specific extensions. I think that's reasonable. It's just that we didn't have the need yet. But it would probably follow the same model where you don't get to enumerate the extension, you just get to ask, do you have extension X? And that thing can return true or false.
Yeah, but that would be a browser API specific thing.
Yeah, either
we
browser
would encourage to follow the same model.
Yeah.
All right, so Mac OS will be Mac OS. OS X will be OS X. The OS platform type will have no equivalence comparison logic at all.
Right.
It's just super simple. And then runtime information.isOS platform would need to handle the equivalence checks. And if needed, the analyzer would duplicate the equivalence checks.
Yeah, and to be clear, like even if you were to make a OS platform having equivalence checks, it wouldn't help your analyzer. Like the analyzer can't call it, right? Because the analyzer runs on full framework.
Right.
And the analyzer is going to have to do it anyway because we're adding Mac OS, but the RID is OS X. So the string that someone is going to have using the attributes we were just discussing is going to be the old one because that's what it is.
Yeah, and that was the only reason why I was thinking having runtime information, have a helper method to check equivalence between two platforms, was so that the analyzer could also call into that, and then OS platform would call into it the same way. But I don't know that it's worth making that a public API.
Yeah, and the analyzer can be running on something older than Net5, so the API wouldn't exist to call. So
good point. Okay. Okay.
There's a reason why it's called static analysis. But yeah. No, it's a common problem. I mean, like that's another reason why we wanted some of this TFM data to be more static in MS Build as data, so you can query it from multiple parties. But like it's actually hard to do that. So we, to this day, don't have that.
Thank you. And then Emma, there was one other update on this kind of realm since last night too, that you and I talked about trying to support like Windows 1, Windows 8.1 without a dot, and having that get inferred the way NuGet does, of inferring the dot between the 8 and the 1.
Yeah.
But that brings back the ambiguity and what does 14 mean? Does 14 mean 14 or does 14 mean 1.4? So we were headed down the path of just not trying to infer dots, always requiring at least one dot in the version. So iOS 14.0 would be required, and iOS 14 is not supported.
So what happens if I don't put one? Does the analyzer give me an error for that, or?
Yep.
Good. Okay.
Well, let's see. Yeah. How would that surface?
Yeah, I mean, you applied the minimum OS whatever attribute, and it says this doesn't match my regular expression, so this is garbage, and it reports an error.
Yep.
I think I'm okay with that. Like I think if we want silent behavior for those, then I would assert we should match what NuGet does, because then you have at least the same problem.
Yeah, and that's what I started to lean toward last night too. But iOS 14 feels like we would be leading people into a pit of failure there.
Oh, for sure.
They would write iOS 14, assume that means 14, and we would interpret as 1.4.
That's the same problem why we said like in the TFM, because we can't undo it for NuGet, right? Because that's unfortunately ship behavior. But like we said, like because we will have .NET 10 soon, given the current versioning speed, right? We basically said that's why we burn in the 0.0 in the project files, and we encourage everybody to put a 0.0, but it is still legal to not have the 0.0. And Net 5 still means Net 5.0. But also Net 10 will mean Net 1.0, which is not very useful.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Yep, that works for me. All right, so then...
All right, can you have an issue from yesterday that after the meeting got some feedback that I want to put before people? So 17590. 590.
590.
Yeah, so the thing that sailed through super easy, I used hash as the method name, but there's already a property named hash. Turns out that's not legal.
I can see that.
So I think the best suggestion so far on alternative names is hash data as the verb. So hash data, and try hash data. The instance method is called compute hash. The other one would be get hash, but it feels get and compute together feel very weird. So.
Oh my God! Does it now mean I can finally compute a hash code in one line of code?
Yeah, we approved this yesterday.
Well, I wasn't here like yesterday, or there, I guess.
It was at the very end.
Oh, I didn't pay attention. Well, maybe.
Yeah, it was crypto. No one cared. So the proposal here, and then just replace all hashes with hash data is, I think, what I am happiest with. The other one would be stateless hash or static hash, but that feels more like we put a word here because we have to. I mean, honestly, that's what we're doing. But
I mean, the other
Levi,
thing that
your
might
button's
work is
stuttering.
hash all.
Yeah, what I'm doing is I'm just looking at all the static members that are already on things like SHA-256.
But yeah, the hash algorithm base class defined a property called hash, which I forgot about. And
I mean, what about a hash all?
Well, so here's the thing. Like when I type SHA-256 dot, I see create equals and reference equals. So honestly, anything that has the word hash would be clearly the thing I want to use here.
Yeah,
Yeah. So hash data seems just fine.
works for me.
But yeah, when I hit dot, I'm going to see 4 things. One says hash. Great.
Yep. All right. So I'll update it to say hash data, and then I guess you need me to debounce it through ready for review and approved, so it gets picked up.
Gets picked up for what?
Emo's video scrubber.
Yeah, because yeah, it's nice to have notes, as it turns out. By the way, for the designs, I also added labels now, so we can also mark the designs, which of course I didn't do, which actually makes the notes slightly useless, but I can
We
manage
added
it.
the feature, so good job.
It's under pull request, obviously.
I think that sounded meaner than I intended, but
Oh, that's
it
fine.
was supposed to be sarcastic. Polite sarcasm, not mean sarcasm. Listen to my intention.
All right, so it's no more blocking. We said API needs work. All right, good enough.
All right. Needs work and approved. All right.
Sweet.
Anybody have a 10-minute issue?
Otherwise, I'll pick a random one.
Are there any marked as blocking?
No, I checked earlier this morning. I mean, unless somebody marked it since the meeting started.
Give me 1 sec.
What do you want us to look at, Steve?
I actually don't have anything top of mind.
Okay, I've launched my viewer app. It just takes a while, which is very sad.
I've actually got one that I think is really small and would be useful to get in the next 5 days.
Okay, tell me.
It's 37681.
Four hours later.
Yeah. And then I have a 1-minute one on standby if we finish this one on time.
So basically, for LinkedListNode, we have an ability to expose the underlying value. However, there's no ability to expose that as a ref, which would be incredibly useful, especially for large structs to avoid a copy. This is completely safe to do, unlike exposing the underlying array for list of for an actual list. So the proposal is just expose public ref t value ref item.
And there's already a value
ref
property, right?
Yeah, and value ref matches the name that we've used elsewhere.
And values are set.
I have no problem with it. I'm curious though, like, where is this end up getting used where the perf is important?
Yeah.
So I actually there's a native memory allocator that I'm porting from native to manage that uses a linked list over a value type. And this is going to be for managing GPU memory, which obviously can't be managed by the GC.
And linked list is the right data structure?
Yep, that's what they use in C++ too.
Yeah, I mean, I will say though, like, I'm kind of with Steven, like I would. Yeah, maybe. I'm skeptical, but like, because I mean, you're right that in C++ you use linked lists, but like linked lists in C++ are usually better perf-wise than this one is. There's a lot of interaction going on, and I'd be curious if you're actually. You might be better off with your own linked list. Basically, that's my point. It's not so much whether you use linked list over arrays. It's more like if you define your own linked list, you're likely to have better perf than having this interaction through another value type in the middle.
Our own linked list is actually fairly efficient. It's just a simple class wrap. The nodes are just a simple class wrapper over a value that points to the next node. There's not much simpler you can get than that.
One nice thing about this too is if you're allocating a bunch of these nodes one after another, you're going to get cache locality as well, just due to how the GC works. We do have a lot of data structures that have T's as get set properties. I wonder if not just here, but we should take a look through some of those other data structures and start exposing more refs throughout the framework.
I looked at some of the other data collection types, and there didn't look to be anything that could obviously be done that was also safe to do.
Okay, fair. Because it's for high performance scenarios, like one argument to be made is, hey, maybe actually we should have been using a field instead of properties here, because then you don't have to worry about having a value ref now.
I guess a ref can't be rewritten to be null, or can it?
You'd have to have a ref to a ref to make that ref null.
Yeah. So even if the setter is guarding null, this wouldn't bypass that. But it would make mutable structs work.
Well. So there is no setter.
For value?
Sorry, there is a setter for value, but it doesn't guard against null. It just assigns whatever you give it.
Fair enough.
So if T was a class, like an object, you could assign the underlying value to be null, but you couldn't make the ref itself null.
Yeah, this API isn't exposing anything you couldn't already do, just like Tanner said. It's just allowing you to do it in a more efficient manner.
Yeah, but something like list, it seems weird because with list, if you got a ref to the position 5, remove like a bunch of things can make position 5 no longer part of the list or now part of a different concept of the list, but the node would have been removed and now it's removed. So you're modifying dead memory at that point, which is fine. Not deallocated, but
so you can have a linked list that's outside of an actual. You can have a node that's outside of the actual linked list because it's a separate entity,
right.
And you can insert it into a new separate list independently.
Right, that's what I'm saying. This one seems safe to me because you're talking about the thing in this box as opposed to with accessing a ref to an array, which is what list of T would give back. That's you're accessing a chunk of memory that may change its semantic meaning. Through other operations on the bigger type.
Right.
So.
All right.
Yeah.
So
and it looks like we actually do use ValueRef as the method name for other concepts along these lines.
Yeah. So what was your quick one, Jeremy?
Hold on. Before we jump over to that one, Emma, there was a question on the static hash helper methods on YouTube that we missed. Frederick had asked, what about hash bytes?
Yeah, to me, hash bytes, hash all, hash data, they all seem fine. I don't have strong preferences.
I feel like I know we've used data elsewhere. I don't know that we've used bytes, but I can look and make a final note later.
Yeah, generally when we include a type name like bytes in an API, it's because we want to clearly call out the fact that it's dealing with bytes as opposed to any other type of T. In this case, that distinction's not necessary.
Yeah, data feels better to me, but I'll look for similar prior art. And Emo just wrote me a blank check, so.
Yeah, the only thing I care about, I think, similar to Levi, is like make sure the name hash is somewhere in there. Other than that, I don't care.
Okay, 35869.
Sorry, 35689.
869.
Jesus, why do I do this?
I would blame German number orderings, but you're not flipping the last two. So
No, like that doesn't work for me.
this is just a span overload for a thing we have an array for.
Well, then that seems fine.
Told you it was easy.
I will bring up the issue that came up last time, which is, do we have to handle null or empty in a special manner?
The array one handles null. If you've turned it into a span already, that's your fault.
All right, sounds good.
That is literally our answer everywhere, except for where it isn't. So doing something other than that is the exception. And I think I own 90% of that special case code, which is all in things like the KDFs for opening PFXs. Because that spec is weird.
All right, then I think we've done a few useful things today. All right, then I guess see you guys next week, or some of you maybe even later today.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.